One day in late December, I released a video on YouTube that discussed my thoughts on this visual novel called Snoot Game. If you're watching a video about this game, I'm pretty confident that you've at least heard about it before, but in case you haven't yet, a brief history lesson. So, there was this game announced during the initial reveal of games lined up for the PS5 in 2020. One of them was called Goodbye Volcano High, a Choices Matter game starring anthropomorphic dinosaurs contending with their last year before an asteroid wipes them all out. It was an earnest game by a modest indie studio out of Montreal that channeled the likes of Life is Strange and Night in the Woods, and it promptly got its head stoved in by people who attended the presentation looking for more dynamic gameplay. Goodbye Volcano High caught the attention of posters on 4chan that decided that they could make their own version of Goodbye Volcano High with blackjack and hookers, and a year to the date of the first official trailer, the first version of Snoot Game was released by dev team Cavemanon, a parody visual novel in which you took control of Anon Y. Mus, a misanthropic shitposter who's roped into the orbit of the characters of Goodbye Volcano High, and eventually develops a relationship with its lead character, Fang. Snoot Game would eventually become something of a dark horse in the visual novel sphere, turning from something conceived through parody into something which has, in spite of its handling of some issues, been earnestly celebrated and embraced by a cult audience, present company included. I've spoken about my opinion on both Snoot Game and Goodbye Volcano High on this channel at this point. They're pretty solid videos if I do say so myself, but I'm apparently getting Jurassic on your asses at least one more time, because Cavemanon released a spiritual successor to Snoot Game on Valentine's Day in 2024. Snoot Game's first official build was released in 2021, a year to the date of Goodbye Volcano High's first official trailer, but Goodbye Volcano High would face a variety of challenges leading up to its final release 3 years later in August of 2023. Ironically enough, Cavemanon dealt with their own issues with delays, between a composer on the team being caught out for plagiarism, extra man-hours in producing animated cutscenes that punctuate the action in between dialogue beats, and I would assume the unique difficulty of wrangling a team that doesn't work in a fixed location or benefit from government funding. Wani That Gator arrived 2 years later than projected, its first trailer dropping in 2021 to announce a release in 2022 before eventually releasing in February of 2024. It was a pretty interesting experience following that game while I was getting a handle on the script for my Snoot Game video. I thought to myself, how cool it would have been to experience 2 back-to-back releases by Cavemanon at the same time, especially since I was already pretty impressed by what I had seen with Snoot Game. But sadly, it wasn't to pass. Goodbye Volcano High was released in August of 2023, summer turned to fall, I experienced some personal upheavals that caused me to take a hiatus from the channel, and so it goes. Memes teasing I Want to Hug That Gator's impending release in 1 week began to surface around winter of 2023, and sure enough, a trailer was released on Cavemanon's YouTube channel on February 7, 2024, confirming its release date to be 1 week away to the date. Pretty classy move. But as I booted up the game that February day, I was struck by the thought that I wasn't even curious about Wani as a spiritual sequel to a visual novel I really liked. They draw from the same premise, yes, but Wani is interesting to me because it was not built in parody of Goodbye Volcano High in the same way that Snoot Game was. No characters from Goodbye Volcano High appear, and references to original Snoot Game characters themselves are kept pretty loose. Given that, a unique onus falls on Cavemanon with this visual novel, unfolding a wholly original love story within the parameters of the parodic setting they've established without interfacing with the parody through irony or humorous jabs about the nature of Goodbye Volcano High's superficial trappings. Essentially, with this, they had to step up to the plate and assert their own legacy. The question is, how did they do? Well, here's my 2 cents. I'm 6i Sun, and this is my review of I Want to Hug That Gator. Alright, you know what it is. It's time for housekeeping. My review of Snoot Game covered the first act of the game, roughly about 3 hours, condensed into a 15-minute long summary. Generally speaking, my reviews tend to shift in favor of giving an abridged account of a game's story, and in a lot of contexts, I think that's a pretty good format. I like writing reviews in this way because it gives me an opportunity to more carefully scrutinize the parts of a game that make me feel things, and I like to think other people like watching it because it's interesting to have a roadmap of someone's personal experiences with the game. You know, maybe it might make you consider angles to look at a work that you haven't previously considered before. The thing is, I'm not going to be doing that this time around because I've been around the block a couple times with summarizing and I'm not 100% sure it would be the best time expenditure in this case. Let me tell you why. I did the math on a couple of playthroughs of the game that I've seen, and I think I can reasonably deduce that a first-time playthrough would take someone who isn't mashing somewhere between 20 to 30 hours from the word go to the moment the credits roll on their first ending. We're not really going into like Yumi Neko territory with those kinds of numbers, but that's still a lot of visual novel, especially for someone who's coming into Wani hot off a Snoot Game, as I've noticed a lot of people tend to do. We're going to go a little bit faster into the meat and potatoes here, give the intro to the game's story a little bit more of a bullet point focus than we typically see on the channel, before we enter a more itemized breakdown of Wani's individual parts: UI, art direction, writing, soundtrack, character analysis, you know, that sort of thing. As far as I know, the devs haven't closed the door on additional content being added eventually. Snoot Game's bonus chapters were added to the game a little over a year after its initial release. However, I can only review the version of the game that I have in my fingers currently, and for most players that's most likely going to be the version available at the time of this writing. I'm going to try to keep more spoiler-heavy observations about these facets of the Wani experience to a minimum in the moments of the video prior to the character analysis section at this timestamp. But I feel it's worth mentioning for the people that could use the content warning that Wani contains earnest depictions and discussions of subject matter which some players might find uncomfortable or disturbing, including bullying, parental neglect, domestic abuse, and gaslighting. If you haven't played the game for yourself and at any point I've convinced you to pick it up, your last chance to bail is going to be at the character analysis section at this timestamp. You will be warned again, but you should abandon any pretense of getting to this game unspoiled if you proceed past that point. I'm going to try to be as impartial as I can while I'm reviewing this game. People who saw my review of Snoot Game know that I didn't make a secret of the fact that I enjoyed it a lot, even in spite of some initial skepticism, and I think I owe Wani the same treatment. I also don't want to write a pass for the flaws it does have for things I wouldn't excuse from other visual novels like it, just because Wani is stock from a solid pedigree. We can agree to disagree on some of my opinions, but I like to think Olivia herself would appreciate my approach. You may have noticed that I've been abridging the full title of the game, I Wani Hug That Gator, to simply Wani. This is how I'm going to be referring to the game throughout. One last thing I should mention is that I'm going to be making multiple comparisons to Snoot Game during this video, and thus it should be understood that this video will also contain Snoot Game spoilers. If you take issue with that, I sincerely apologize, but I think I would submit that comparisons are important to make here. There have been a few years that have passed between Snoot and Wani, and I think comparing the two using Snoot as a baseline and Wani as an evaluation of how far Cavemanon has come is going to be a pretty indispensable part of analyzing Wani. Besides which, I believe comparisons between each are unavoidable in this case, as I don't think anyone can deny, for better or for worse, that both games in this duology have virtually identical premises and gameplay. How identical are we talking, you ask? Well, get comfy. Let me tell you about it. This time around, we play as Inco G. Niito, a human kid who's recently moved to Volcadera Bluffs for his parents' work. He's been transferred into St. Hammond's, a school known for its prestigious art program. Of unique interest to Inco is his only passion larger than designer fashion is his interest in photography. He's outclassed as an artist and a bit outcast as the only human in a school full of dinosaurs, made all the worse by his own desire to make more friends. Shortly after entering the school, Inco runs into Ben, an enterprising photography student, and the two get acquainted as they talk shop about photography for a turn. I like that Inco is especially skilled. It's something that sets him apart from his predecessor. Inco has a lot of flaws too, and we'll get into that soon, but I like that Wani puts us in the perspective of someone with a decent amount of skin in the game. He sees his enrollment in St. Hammond's as a unique opportunity to flourish under an established skill set. Ben gives Inco a tour through St. Hammond's, with Inco discovering that he's the student council president. Inco feels very relieved about knowing someone else who's into photography, and interesting questions about the social climate between humans and saurians are raised when they run into someone in the anthropology club. Anyway, at this point, Inco finds a gorgeous point of reference in Volcadera Bluffs in the form of a beautiful painting done by Halford in the 9th grade. Inco is able to suss out a lot of details about the work that's been invested into it, saying that only a teacher could be able to match the detail. Realizing what he's up against as Ben returns, he finds himself thrust against the wall, only to come gill to gill with our deuteragonist, Olivia Halford, a BARYONYX in a wheelchair clad in a faded hoodie. In spite of how fast she goes, her union with Inco seems to pass in slow motion. She leaves a haunting impression on Inco as she speeds past, and Inco heads to his first class. It's Phys Ed, which sets the stage for his meeting with Damien Payne, his excitement for dodgeball juxtaposing Inco's terror. The game begins, but just as Inco feels the rhythm, he's struck out by a menacing silhouette and sent to the infirmary. When he comes to, the coach takes him to task for showing off while he was playing, finding a single thing he could do and being so focused that he forgot to look around for a second. Coach Solly is convinced that Inco is already finding his own way to give up. He's given the okay to take the day off to rest, but Solly tells him that they had trouble reaching his parents, one huge indicator to Inco's unique dysfunctions. The next day, he has a talk with the superintendent charged with auditing the school, and he chats with Damien again, who keeps pace with Inco to check in on how he's doing. Damien asserts his status as a total bro by giving him the lowdown on Solly and Mia, affirming that Inco will fit in very soon and offering a seat at his lunch table. Inco's class with the AP art and photography teacher, Mr. Iadakan, begins shortly afterwards, but it's especially of note as he is both his photography teacher and the mentor of one Olivia Halford, the connective thread between Inco and her at this time. The two meeting appears to be fated, as Inco has lunch with Damien later and is surprised to see her there as well. He isn't really sure what to make of her, but decides to pursue talking to her in the interest of making new friends. And this desire to make new friends and perhaps close the distance between himself and this girl he keeps seeing sets the stage for the story to come in Wani. Inco and Olivia grow closer as they deal with school bullies, festivals, sickness, grief, and the terminus of their time in high school, bringing with it the age-old conundrum of how to make yourself proud and how to grow up without growing apart. I began this section by pointing out that Wani and Snoot Game have identical elevator hooks, but I think I need to explain that in spite of this, Wani doesn't feel derivative in its actual execution. I'm going to talk about the technical aspects of Wani's writing in just a couple of moments, but if you're asking how it is as an actual story, I would say overall that it's very good. I think after having played this game that I can say that Cavemanon is very good at writing romances about people that are imbued by the power of your own autonomous choices to find or forsake their own redemption. So if you're going into this review on the fence about whether it warrants a purchase, I would argue that it at the very least warrants buying it on a sales price. And if you want to wet your beak a little on this game's opening act, there's a demo available that covers about 3 hours of gameplay, and I barely touched the surface of it here. I'm skimming the surface of this game's opening act in the interest of addressing more in-depth observations and criticisms a little bit faster, but as I mentioned multiple times on the show, I don't personally believe watching gameplay or hearing a recap is a worthy substitute for playing the game oneself. It's worth mentioning though that it isn't until shortly after the chapters covered in the demo that the rubber met the road and I realized I was playing Peak. If you know, you know, and maybe that could make it more of a slow burn, but it's more like a regular burn to a sick fuck like me. Wani punches pretty hard above Snoot Game's weight class in terms of the depths of the emotions explored, and I think that the protagonists are affected by obstacles to their relationship and themselves that feel larger in scope and an emotional complication than what Fang and Anon have to deal with in Snoot Game. It feels a bit more mature. Maybe it has a few more dinosaurs than the average, but it's a solid-ass love story. The chemistry between our main characters is a big part of this, yes, but Wani demonstrates a net improvement across a variety of the pillars on which I judge Snoot Game. And now you're going to hear about it. I think that we've sufficiently summarized and addressed observations about Wani's story, but I think jumping into the question of how its writing serves on a technical level is a good way to begin our cross-examination of the game as a whole. So let's begin. The writing for Wani in general is far less caustic than Snoot Game. In spite of my overall enjoyment of it, a lot of Snoot Game's themes, as well as how it handles them, makes it an arduous task for me to recommend to the average person without a handful of disclaimers. It pulls very few punches in its statements, and while the game's retinue is comprised entirely of 4chan users, this fact leaked through a lot of choice syllables in their writing, shall we say. We might be able to chalk this up to our protagonist Inco being a bit more of a normie than Anon is, but Wani presents an earnest effort towards diminishment of Chan vernacular and specific humor, and I assume that's in the interest of wider dissemination. I think whether this changes to its benefit or detriment is something that you'll have to decide for yourself. For my part, I enjoyed its more measured approach, but I did find myself occasionally missing some of the wackier swings Snoot Game made to draw humor out of its story. I mean, you have to admit, the fact that most of the teachers in Snoot Game were Adult Swim references added something incredibly unique and fun to the world. Some of the side characters and even some of the teachers play on cultural references like this, but you're not going to see Carl Bertin and Anna Dluski teaching math here. In some respect, I feel a little sad that Wani misses out on that element of humor. I think that Snoot Game had a really unique system of build-up and release where its more grounded, character-driven, and occasionally emotional moments were offset by very precise placements of wackiness and humor. If you've ever played a Yakuza game, you probably know what I mean by this. It can be a seesaw, and you can get the balance wrong, but the things I've seen that can get it just right are worth writing home about. But at the same time, I think it's worthy of praise that Cavemanon's sophomore dinosaur visual novel carries itself in a way that's a little more sober and down-to-earth. Especially since I think most of Snoot Game's finest moments happen when it dispensed of its parodic roots and let genuine moments rock between its characters. Wani did a solid job of balancing a loose slice-of-life tone while occasionally offering heart-to-hearts with certain characters that just took my breath away. Which I think is a good segue into my final point for this leg of the video. I think that the writing of Wani's story is sometimes harmed by poor pacing, but I believe every character that I interact with, and I think that's one of the biggest proponents for me in terms of whether or not a visual novel lands. We'll elaborate on these characters a little bit later, but in a nutshell, I think the things that Wani does well in terms of its writing, it does really well. If you watched my video on Snoot Game, you'd know that the soundtrack was one of the first big things that really caused me to stand at attention when it came to the production as a whole. I thought it was great. It ripped with charisma, and I love that there was a calculated use of different genres to drive home that Cavemanon are wildcards. They're aberrations in their own way, and their romance is kind of unpredictable. Big shoes are being filled as far as Wani's soundtrack goes, both in terms of music and if it's composed with the same kind of intention. Before I jump into the question of whether or not Wani's soundtrack meets the mark, I ought to explain that Wani's soundtrack is split into two parts. An A-side, which includes original compositions by Mellow-Anon, the composer for Snoot Game, with occasional contributions by Shampoo-Anon, and a B-side that contains music that's in the public domain. I'd mostly describe Wani's unifying sound as being lo-fi hip-hop with occasional jazz influences. Rock/metal and the odd droning synth are used to convey more tense moments. I like the overall sound of the A-side of the soundtrack a lot. There are a lot more hits than there are misses, and there are a couple of reprises of themes from Snoot Game, such as Amberlight Brilliance, Appreciating the Atmosphere, and my personal favorite, To Swagger. I love how comfy the tracks Inco and Olivia, as well as Mural de Melanoma are. Wani's A-side has a great energy all throughout, but I love how those two tracks slow things down with a simple piano melody, which I think neatly conveys the warmth that comes to blossom between the two. If I were to rank the songs on the A-side, it would probably look something like this. The B-side of Wani's soundtrack is more focused on easy listening and sources from a variety of different artists, though I think Holizna deserves a special mention, as their songs do a lot of heavy lifting on the B-side. They're active on YouTube, and their mission statement involves making music specifically for the public domain that everyone can use. I think it's really cool, and I think coolness deserves to be showcased, so if you haven't yet, go show them some love. Anyway, while I don't know if the B-side knocks it out of the park quite as much as the A-side, I think most of the songs that are on it are solidly good, and the ones that I'm not crazy about are either not really my cup of tea, or they're looped kind of clumsily when played in the actual game, and it just brings attention to how long certain scenes have gone on for. Kinda hard for me to come down on it too hard, but my qualms with it are either due to personal taste or just seem a little nitpicky. I don't really know which soundtrack I like more between Snoot Game and Wani. I think that Wani's OST demonstrates a definitive jump in Mellow-Anon skill, but I think if I needed to make a choice at gunpoint, I would say that Snoot Game has more memorable tracks that more neatly complement its atmosphere. But I think that you should take that statement for what it's worth, since I got Patrick Schwasted and bought FL Studio 5 years ago, and I haven't composed a good goddamn thing in it since. I think the soundtrack might be one of the few places where I think Wani falls short compared to its forebear, so I think it's a good time for me to pivot into one of Wani's facets that I can be more unambiguously positive about. I'm not going to hem and haw here. The art style and direction in Wani is a straight up improvement from Snoot Game. While there are backgrounds in certain scenes that are stylized photographs, Wani's backgrounds aren't quite as reliant on stylized photographs as Snoot Game's were. There are more painted backgrounds here, which I think gives the game a lot more visual cohesion with character sprites. Speaking of character sprites, I think that they're very appealing. Writ large, they feel more polished than the sprites from Snoot Game. They feel more expressive and lively. I think my favorite example of this is probably whenever this character Liz is on screen. She's a brachiosaur, and they pull this really cool trick with her where the sprites for her body and her head are separated to call attention to how vast her neck is, so they can be separately emotive. Her intro scene with Inco has her body typing at a computer as her head swings around as she asks him questions. The end result is really cute, and I think it's an incredibly creative way to bring a long-necked dinosaur character in this setting to life. In my opinion, Liz is probably the most fun and memorable character design in this game. I also like how this is done with Mr. Ferris, the superintendent who's keeping an eye on St. Hammond's. He has occasional talks with Inco on the train to school, and I like how his eye blinks occasionally. He remains pretty static, but I think the fact that they took care to do this neatly conveys how vast he is. This segues into the animated sequences this game has to offer. I was immediately struck upon starting this game that Inco's ride to school on the train is animated. A passenger flipping through the newspaper, the train occasionally jostling on the rails, a woman scrolling on her phone. Shortly after, we see animated scenes in the form of establishing Inco, Ben, and Olivia. They're kept relatively few and far between after the intro to the game, but I think it's incredibly cool that these were implemented at all. Wani frequently delivers on little ways to demonstrate that it's a higher effort production than Snoot Game, and I think it was a very shrewd way to demonstrate this in the opening minutes of the game, because it definitely made me sit a little straighter in my seat whenever they came up. I don't know, I like the art style for this game a lot. Snoot Game already had pretty polished art, but I think they used a combination of really fun tricks and a commitment to a larger scope of character movement and animation to greatly improve upon this in Wani. Just booting up the game and accessing the main menu, you can tell that Cavemanon is playing for keeps this time around. Main menu items are listed at the top of the screen to make room for an animation underneath. Olivia, our titular Gator, sitting by a big fountain. It's very pretty, and a remix of Amberlight Brilliance plays as the game waits for you to select an option. It's mysterious and inviting. The save load function is pretty out of the box for Ren'Py. It has a picture preview of your save points, about 68 save slots, quick saves, and automatic saves. I like the default loadout for Ren'Py a lot. Some devs prefer to camouflage that UI in order to sell a more original experience, and I guess, but I don't believe in fixing something that isn't broken. I appreciate that I at least know when to expect that I'll run out of save slots. God knows I certainly like that in some of the games I play that use that engine. Some games just don't include that information as a matter of course, and I don't really appreciate it if I'm being honest. It could legitimately be one of the only things I genuinely dislike about Katawa Shoujo. Sorry, that was a minor digression. There's mod support in a gallery as well, all the better to track one's progress to 100% completion. There's also a little gallery that stores the drawings that you do throughout the game, which is kind of a cute extra touch. Mine are for shit, but you'd be surprised at how many people have made really impressive stuff when they were prompted to do so. I also really like the way that they handled how you get different endings. After your first playthrough, you unlock the option to manipulate point totals at the beginning of the game. For people that don't know, the core gameplay of Wani and Snoot Game relies on the different choices you make throughout the story. Some choices impacting Inco's personal growth and others impacting Olivia's. These choices do not impact what goes on in the story so much as they impact the relationship and growth of our two lead characters, and the balance that you strike between the two, or lack thereof, will impact which ending you get out of 4 potential possibilities. I've noticed some people crawling out of the woodwork to express misgivings about the same system they use in Snoot Game returning in Wani, but if I'm being honest with you and with myself, I really can't get behind that sentiment. I really like this system, and when I talked about it in my video on Snoot Game, I mentioned that I don't have an issue with my choices not impacting the core narrative as long as the characters that I interact with are compelling and believable. Spoiler alert, they are, but more on that in the next section. Being given the option to manipulate point totals in the onset of the game is a really nice gift for players that want to see all the endings. You can give Inco and Olivia the lowest amount of points for the worst endings, the highest for the golden ending, and some in between for endings 2 and 3. You also get to drop yourself into whichever scene in the story that you like once you set those parameters, and I really appreciate having that degree of control. I really wish that each scene included a descriptor when you hover over it so you know exactly where you're going, but that they included it at all is already a pretty big improvement over my first experience trying to get all the endings for Snoot Game. I have to say, the effort is appreciated. On the surface, visual novels may seem like very simple games, but I'm happy that these devs are willing to extend certain allowances in order for players to get the most out of their experiences. To move this section towards its conclusion, I think the only thing that really bothers me about Wani is that there's no bonus chapters that you unlock after completing each ending. And I think that's a real shame. I extolled the various virtues of the system when it was used in Snoot Game. It's an intrinsic reward for the player being invested in the story and taking the time to choose different endings. It expands our understanding of the characters by letting us spend just a little more time with them, which I think is sorely needed, given that a common criticism I hear of this game's narrative is that it's too focused on Olivia and Inco. And I mean, I'm not going to question why a game titled I Wani Hug That Gator is going to focus on the titular goddamn Gator and the would-be hugger in question. However, I like the characters that we see in their orbit a lot too, and I want to like him even more. And I could huff some copium and say that it's not like the door is necessarily closed in this sort of content being added in the future, but I want to bring up my disappointment on this matter for 2 reasons. One, that Cavemanon is already moving forward with the next project, which severely dampens the possibility this sort of thing will be added in future. And 2, that I am presently only capable of reviewing the version of the game that I have currently. So I don't know. Wani has improved UI in pretty much every conceivable way from Snoot Game, but one of Snoot Game's best features was lost in the shuffle. The monkey's paw curls, I guess. I think that talking about UI is the last thing that I want to mention before we get into character analysis. There's still time to get out before I get started on that, and thus get into heavier spoilers for the remainder of the game, but that time is rapidly running out. I'm the kind of guy that likes to save the best for last, so we're going to start things off by talking about Ben and Mia. They're a pretty hot topic when it comes to discussion of this game, and I'm excited to dive in. So all pretense abandoned, ye who enter here. It's spoiler territory from here on out. Benjamin is one of the first people that Inco meets and talks to at St. Hammond's. The student council president and a fellow photographer, Benjamin is very quickly an image of what Inco wants to be himself. He's uniquely skilled, handsome, charismatic, able to diffuse many a situation with incredibly practiced ease. It would be tempting to suggest at first pass that his only real flaw is his choice in romantic partners. His girlfriend is Mia Moretti. She has spikes and sinew, and she zeroes in and exacts dominance upon Olivia and Inco for their comparative weakness. We're going to talk more about Mia in a little bit, but suffice it to say, an upwardly mobile student council president and a thuggish jock is certainly a pair that would raise my eyebrows, at least at first glance. But I think it isn't until we start to dig a little deeper into Ben that we start to see things a little differently. When Inco enters Olivia's orbit, he becomes the sole source of connective tissue between Olivia and Ben. The pair had a pretty massive falling out before the story begins, and Olivia recalling the reason why is a big part of what galvanizes her friendship with Inco. Ben was originally a good friend to Olivia, but eventually wrote an article about her in freshman year, praising her talents in spite of her disability. This caused a schism between the pair that has not healed to this day, and Ben has been pretty blasé about the entire matter, being more focused on Olivia not inconveniencing others than he is about their friendship and her well-being, and even suggesting that framing her disability this way is the only way that she'll succeed out there. It's real fucking schmoll behavior.
I see some confusion among the members, so let me just clarify. A schmoll is a dude with a good heart who kind of sucks.
Even in the moments prior to Olivia revealing more about Ben's character, we can see that his ability to view situations rapidly can also manifest in jumping between cold intimidation and cheerful encouragement, striking terror in Inco as he outlines the punitive measures the school takes against fraud, and not even flinching as he returns to his affable self immediately afterwards. It betrays something a little unnerving under the surface. It's hard to reconcile this kindly, hardworking, and affable professional that we meet with the supercilious, two-faced social climber that Olivia knows, and it's not until much later in the story that we come to understand the nuances of him as a character, the paradox of Benjamin McKnight. In the most positive ending of the story, Ben eventually comes to take issue with some of his girlfriend's behavior and actions throughout the story, and the moment that he does, his relationship begins to unravel, him along with it, having a tete-a-tete with Inco eventually about how much he's struggling, and how everyone has different rules, but he just has to keep it up. It isn't until later on that we get to see what he means. We eventually learn that Ben needs to take antipsychotics. We never get to be privy to the particulars of his condition. Inco respects his wishes to not go into further detail about it, but Ben makes it clear that he's tried really hard to mask throughout his time in school. And I think it's here where the conflict really shines with Olivia and Ben. Ben is pretty much everything that Olivia isn't on the surface, but he's been dealing with a disability of his own, albeit one that he can manage with medication and therapy. We'll get into Olivia and her own struggles with imposter syndrome in a bit, but I think I was very struck by how Ben likely deals with imposter syndrome himself. Being very well regarded within the student body, yet living with the tangible fear of the same people who venerate him being aware of his condition, to say nothing of being in a relationship with an emotionally and physically abusive partner that holds his condition over his head. It's not a dilemma that most people want to be left alone in the same room with, and this is another situation where I wish bonus chapters were a factor, as I would have loved to have played a part of the story from Ben's perspective. I've heard people say that the criticism they have of this game is that side characters aren't as developed as they should be, although I think Ben is a lot like Naomi from Snoot Game in that he has a lot of interesting characterization if you read between the lines. I do think that point of contention is evident whenever I think about it. I would have loved to have seen more from him, gotten more insight into his own internal story. But the story of Ben McKnight is also the story of Mia Moretti, and given that her very first appearance in the story is giving Inco a concussion with a dodgeball, I think it's safe to say that she's somebody who believes in making an impactful first impression. You could say she combines the worst aspects of the antagonist from Snoot Game, an unholy union of Trish's penchant for physical violence and Naomi's capacity for social manipulation, with, it should be noted, none of their compassion. I'd like to take a sidebar here to briefly discuss the way Snoot Game and Wani handle the subject of bullying. Bullying is a major theme across both games, with the main characters of each actively living within its specter and/or dealing with trauma resulting from it. I think it's rather tempting to picture bullying and picturing a physically abusive Nelson Muntz or Flash Thompson situation, but I think Snoot Game and Wani both discuss the matter and the perpetrators that commit it in a more nuanced light. Swirlies and locker shovings, while still occurring, have mostly fallen out of vogue in the playbook as social shunning, emotional abuse, and blackmail have become more prominent, especially in the digital age. Mia has mastered both, and she has two friends that join in on abusing Olivia. Inco meets the two of them earlier on before this comes to light, and he reflects on how puzzling and strange it is that two well-intentioned, if slightly racially insensitive characters could be pulled into joining in on such a cruel, underhanded practice. I find Wani interesting in the way that it handles the school's social climate. Volcano High, as presented in Snoot Game, is a school that doesn't seem like the easiest place to grow up. There's always some racial tension bubbling underneath, not only between dinosaurs and humans, but between carnivorous and herbivorous dinosaurs. The threat of violence constantly simmering under a thin veneer of civility. By contrast, the dinosaur students in St. Hammond's are mesmerized by seeing a human in person for the first time, but seem largely unconcerned with Inco in general shortly after his first day in school. However, Mia and her friends are proof that bullying exists in St. Hammond's too, but is far more insidious. The antagonists in Snoot Game were rounded to have larger motivations behind their actions, but I find Mia kind of interesting as a villainous character because she defied this expectation of mine. I thought to myself, she is viciously cruel, callous, and violent, but this series has delivered upon pretty multifaceted characters, so I'll take it in faith that she probably has something good inside of her. But I was wrong. Mia isn't just as awful as she seems to be, she's even worse under the surface, with the golden ending revealing that she's been emotionally and physically abusing her own boyfriend, even going so far as to steal and withhold medication that Ben uses to manage psychosis. I think it's telling of how far gone Mia is as a person that you can only really connect with her if you're on track for the worst ending in the game, which is admittedly something that I've put off doing for over a year after getting the 3 other endings. There are some really interesting insights into her character here if you go down this road. Coach Solly mentions earlier in the game that he likes her, and he might very well be the only person that we see in the game that she respects in turn. She's been top of her class for drama for 4 years running, which clarifies her capacity for manipulation, and almost certainly clarifies why she's enrolled in St. Hammond's in the first place. She thinks that everyone can and will betray everyone else at a moment's notice, a sentiment which explains her attitude towards her friends, such as they are, and her relationship, such as it is. But I think Cavemanon pulled a unique trick with Mia. If you want to understand her motivations more, you have to drag yourself down to her level. and I think that makes her uniquely compelling. Because I wanted to find the good in her so bad. Hell, even now I reflect upon her notion that everyone is willing to betray everyone else at a moment's notice, and I find myself wondering who the hell hurt her. But she was so determined to prove me wrong for believing in that goodness at every turn, and in the end, her parting gift for my efforts was leaving me in the wreckage of the worst ending in the game. By the time I was at the finish line of the golden ending, I felt an emotion I rarely feel towards anyone. Complete, profound disgust. I think that Mia also could have benefited from more time in the oven, but I think that I could have such a visceral reaction to her at the end of the game is something of an accomplishment. She might not be the most well-developed character, but I do think she's an incredibly effective antagonist. Benjamin cements himself pretty early in the story as one of Inco's colleagues, a kindred spirit in the arts with plenty of ambition and a lot of talent to back it up. Damien comes into Inco's life not long afterwards, a friendship forged in the sweaty crucible of gym class. He's laid back and doesn't take things too seriously, which I think pairs him nicely with Inco, someone who's comparatively very fretful, detail-oriented, and focused on appearances. Where Inco balks at the idea of playing dodgeball during their first gym class, Damien simply peps up, considering himself very lucky that they get to play a game on the first day of school, which I think tells you everything that you need to know about the guy. Inco later learns that he's connected to Olivia too, she lives with his family, and that Damien tries to go out of his way to bring people into her orbit, thinking that it would be nice for her to get out of her shell a little. He isn't a manipulative person in this end though, a social chess master like Naomi he is not. I picture him more like Mike Tyson pushing his pigeons' faces together. Now kid. Damien is a very likable character, a real golden retriever type, and given that he's something of the ego to Olivia's id, I like that he's paired with a more super ego-oriented and calculating woman. Liz is the treasurer for the student government, has ambitions to work as an art dealer after graduation, and she has a friendship and a poorly concealed crush on Damien. I like that when you first meet her, you're given the option to pick whether Damien or Ben ask you to see her. I always like to pick Damien here because she's very happy that Damien was thinking about her. I think that Liz is a really cool character. She's very grounded in reality compared to Damien and Olivia, has a bit of a sardonic streak, and she's probably the most professionally ambitious character in the cast. As I said earlier, I think she has the most memorable and fun design in the game, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think my only gripe about her is that I wish she had more screen time. I would have loved to have gotten more time with her and Damien. Especially since I think both of them have interesting internal conflict. There's one scene later on where Liz invites Olivia and Inco to have lunch with her, but tensions between the girls boil over when Olivia is more laissez-faire about the future than Liz wants or expects, especially given her potential, skill, reputation, and resources at her disposal. We see Liz putting in work to get her efforts recognized in the art contest, so it's possible that there may be a bit of jealousy at best and resentment at worst. We see the latter come out in full force in the worst ending of the game, where Damien gets pushed to his breaking point after suffering Olivia's callous behavior one time too many, washing his hands of her for good. Damien always finds a way to stay positive in every other ending of the game, so it's jarring to see him get righteously enraged. Ending 1 sees everyone at their very worst, Olivia descending into a spiral of apathy and self-loathing, Inco becoming self-aggrandizing and abusive, Ben is still in a toxic relationship with Mia, and Liz, tall as she is unwilling to stand up for herself. But even when Damien is furious with Olivia and all too willing to let her go, he still decides to defend her when the chips are down because that's who he is in the dark, and I think that makes him really cool, and a cut above the comedy relief that we often see in other parts of the story. I would have loved to have seen a couple of scenes that really zeroed in on Damien and Liz's relationship, and maybe even their own individual issues with Olivia, especially since some tension in their relationship with her always feels like it's on the back burner. I just wish that I could have spent more time picking their brains, but so it goes. Maybe that in itself is a compliment to their characters. Trent Iadakan is one of Inco's teachers at St. Hammond's and the authority figure at the school who's the most outwardly attached to his students' success. He's very quick to take Inco under his wing and seizes the opportunity to have him share a book with Olivia after Inco was absent for most of the first day, which makes Iadakan the catalyst for the couple's first formal introduction. Iadakan has an avuncular relationship to Olivia, being both a mentor to her art and a source of comfort that moors her in times of stress. He goes to bat for her when he suspects people are gossiping about her and spills some amusing anecdotes to Inco once he realizes that he's playing for keeps. He's also a great teacher in his own right, revealing new possibilities to Inco every time he brings out a new tool during his instructions, and being unafraid to embellish his lessons with a little bit of crude language to keep people engaged and entertained. It isn't long before Inco begins to look up to him a lot himself, feeling that he has the entire world to gain from following his lessons. I remember in my Katawa Shoujo retrospective about Shizune Hakamichi, I briefly mentioned how it can be difficult to instruct someone without learning something new about yourself along the way, and I think Iadakan is a good example of this. In his opening scene, we see him brandishing a quill pen, and in one of the turning points of Act 1, he explains that it's purposed from a feather from his wife, and after having a talk with Olivia about one of his assignments, that he uses it as a reminder to do his job right, for the people he cares about, and for the people his students care about. I think what makes him especially cool is that Iadakan walks the walk. One major story beat with him involves him recruiting Ben and Inco into doing photography work for a wedding ceremony involving two of his friends. Inco is distracted a little bit by Olivia texting him, but I like that they found a way to bring back the taxi driver from Snoot Game. I'm trying to watch through all of Venture Brothers at the moment, and I like that this guy's whole deal is that he loves to smoke, especially since the character he's based on seems to really hate it. Anyway, I like how this particular leg of the story proceeds a lot, because through Iadakan's attempts to help Inco and Ben, we get to hear more about how he tries to help other people too. He's introduced the bride and groom to each other, and it's here that we get a choice that helps to define Inco, whether he focuses on his work or gets carried away with the atmosphere and fixates in his relationship with Olivia. Iadakan never really confirms this as such, but I like to think it's something of a test of where Inco is at. He seems to be a fan of the Miyagi method, as he comes to realize that Mia has been extorting Olivia into doing her work because he could recognize her style, but wanted Olivia to talk to him rather than impart punitive measures like Ben mentions earlier. He always tries to do right by the people around him in a way that respects their agency, always seizes opportunities for teachable moments, and tries to avoid directly interfering unless it's absolutely necessary. I've been fortunate enough to have teachers like him, and I think Iadakan is probably my favorite character I've seen Cavemanon do yet. Which makes it such a colossal gut punch when we find out that he's been fighting a secret battle with chondrosarcoma that he will always lose, regardless of whatever ending you're going towards. It's brutal, and it sets the stage for the third act pretty neatly. Iadakan's absence is felt throughout the rest of the story, and how well Olivia and Inco have grown as individuals will impact how they respond to his loss. I Wani Hug That Gator is a story about love and growing up, and it does both of these things very well, but it's also a story about how we process grief and losing the ones that we love, and I think it really shines here in particular. I have a lot of issues with how Wani's characters are handled at times, but I think Iadakan is an indispensable part of its fabric. He sticks around for long enough to have a profound impact, and, top bloke that he is, he never overstays his welcome in doing so. He's a character who's always focused on potential, hope, and doing good unto others without expecting anything in return, and I think we could all benefit from having someone like that in our lives. It's a noble example to follow. It's something I'd like to carry with me for a long time. Inco G. Niito and Olivia Halford are the two characters at the center of I Wani Hug That Gator's romance and story. He's a fashion-conscious, neurotic guy who moves around constantly because of his parents' work, but he wants to make a name for himself as a photographer during his time at his new school, and maybe make some friends in his senior year. She's a prodigy behind a paintbrush whose acerbic demeanor and sharp tongue belie a deep-seated worry that her art is perceived as great only due to her being wheelchair-bound, which has given her a deep-seated lack of confidence in herself and in her work. We experienced the story through Inco, and to start things off, I remember saying of Anon that I wouldn't be likely to grab a pint with him and be his best friend, but I find Inco interesting because I would grab a beer with him, before he gave me an unprompted lecture about seasonal microbrews that would make me want to quit drinking altogether. Inco is a fundamentally kindly but lonely person who is possessed by an intrinsic desire to be one of the smartest and most uniquely capable people in the room, very keen on being so perceived as such that he can accrue a following, on social media or otherwise. He navel-gazes frequently on his skills, compares them to others constantly, and I think a core crux of his internal conflict is the split between emphasizing his relationships with other people or trying to climb higher up the ladder, his focus on the former doubtlessly exacerbated by the extent to which his parents neglect him. He and Ben neatly complement each other in this regard. Far before he knows more about Ben's own unique dysfunctions, he looks up to him for how uniquely skilled and capable he is in social situations, and wishes that he could emulate some of that behavior. One major turning point for Inco is an art competition that happens early in the story. Inco and Olivia both enter, but Olivia swaps Inco's entry for her own, believing that if her entry won, Inco would take the credit for the W without asking any questions, and that she would receive a modicum of proof that her work has inherent value, without being viewed through the lens of the artist having a disability. I think the fact that Olivia believed Inco wouldn't have any reservations about taking credit for work that isn't his really speaks to how little Olivia initially thinks of Inco's drive, but she does know firsthand how that kind of ambition has its dark side, and she lives to see it again depending on how you choose how Inco handles certain situations. At Inco's best, he comes to realize that Ben's way of navigating the world comes with its own unique problems, and that he can figure things out his own way. At Inco's worst, he never gets to realize that a friend to all is a true friend to none, and he becomes so self-absorbed and so focused on greasing the wheels of his own influence that he eschews his relationship to the point of developing a friendship with a bully that's been antagonizing him, and his girlfriend, all year long. Inco is quite a bit more tender-hearted than Anon, but I think he has a far greater capacity for darkness, which I think makes him an interesting character to get behind. With that said, he's just enough of a naive little wienerhead that I find myself facepalming at some of the shit he says. I don't really know, I like Inco a lot. I was that arts kid with aspirations of being a big shot long ago, and if I'm being honest with you, I think that part of me never really left. I see some of myself in Inco for better and for worse. I really like Olivia too. I opened up my discussion of Inco by mentioning a comment I made about Anon from Snoot Game. And in the spirit of that, I'll mention that I said towards the end of my review that Anon has some edges that he would do well to sand down, and I think that's something that Olivia has in common with him. That ghastly stare she seems to give directly down the camera during her introduction really says it all from the jump, and talking to her at first, she isn't much friendlier. If you watch my video on Snoot Game, you'd know that one big reason I decided to give it a try in the first place was because a 4chan developed visual novel with roots in parody that ended up being an incredible experience in its own right was something that I've experienced before. It's one I talk about on this very channel, Katawa Shoujo. So I was especially curious about how they'd handle this particular story and Olivia's arc within it, because one of the routes of Katawa Shoujo involves falling in love with an artist that has a disability, who's thrust into the public eye and finds herself facing issues with how people perceive her art because of that disability. I'm going to be spending a lot of time and energy talking about Reen's story arc at a later date, so I'm not going to get into the meat and potatoes of it here, but Reen's route in Katawa Shoujo is one that's very dear to me, and I think I was worried upon playing Wani for the first time that it would feel somewhat derivative. But my concerns were not really warranted. I think Olivia's conflicts, flaws, and the way that she interacts with her disability are distinct from Reen in pretty much every way that actually matters. And besides all of that, she's a really fully realized, original, and fun character. I think it's really cool that we get to see behind these walls that she puts up. Between her talking about living with Damien's family, her opening up about her father when Inco discusses his relationship with his own parents, and her showing you the treasures that she keeps in her room, getting to know Olivia feels like a real treat. I won't rob you of getting to experience that yourself, but there's one part towards the golden ending of the game where she makes an esoteric reference to one of my favorite reviews on YouTube, and it made me crack right the fuck up. Inco and Olivia have a lot going on, but they're both passionate little nerds in their own way, and I think above all else, that's what makes me root for them. Maybe we all just paint and take photographs in order to reach out. Maybe those simple acts might redeem us all yet. I had my doubts that Cavemanon could deliver upon the standard that Snoot Game had set for them, but after having played it, I think it's clear. I Want to Hug That Gator is not only a worthy successor to Snoot Game, but a compelling and charming love story in its own right. It delivers deftly upon the social themes that Snoot Game touched upon, and handled the new subjects of disability, imposter syndrome, and the legacy we leave behind incredibly elegantly. I feel a fair amount of my channel's oeuvre so far has covered visual novels with dinosaur characters as well as visual novels featuring characters with disabilities. Wani hits smack dab in the middle of that Venn diagram, so it's really no small wonder that I really like it. I don't think it quite matches up to the highest highs of Snoot Game or Katawa Shoujo, but I think it's an incredibly worthy runner-up to both of their examples. With Cavemanon beginning production in earnest on their new visual novel, Exit 665, one unrelated to Snoot Game or Wani, it seems all too assured that we won't be getting a new game in the series anytime soon. But fans of Snoot Game and Wani have taken it upon themselves to make fan games that take place in the same universe. And while it may be a long road to see them completed, I think some of them look very promising. Hold On To Me and Devlog are presently my personal favorites. Cavemanon may be taking a rest from the Snoot-verse, but maybe we'll be okay without him for now. Maybe all we need is a creative vision and the gumption to see it through. Maybe all we have to do is ask ourselves, if you could leave right now and go do anything you wanted, what would you want to do? Thank you very much for watching.